Good afternoon, everyone. Today's seminar features two great speakers, and we're really excited to welcome Sara Villani from North Carolina. She's an assistant professor and extension specialist of fruit and woody ornamental pathology at North Carolina State University's Mountain Horticultural Crops Research and Extension Center. Sara's research interests include understanding the mechanisms which drive practical fungicide and antibiotic resistance, understanding the effect of abiotic stressors on the disease development, and the development of chemical, biological, and cultural strategies for the management of economically important diseases of fruit and woody ornamentals in the southeastern United States. Sara's extension activities include co-developing apple disease content for the My IPM smartphone app, developing the North Carolina Appalachian Apples Extension Portal, and developing an apple bitter root rot management program for North Carolina apple growers, which has saved the North Carolina apple industry over $1 million on an annual basis. For these efforts, Sara was the recipient of the North Carolina Cooperative Extension 2019 Dr. Joseph and Mrs. Lisée Zublena Program Impact Award. Thank you, Sara, and welcome to the webinar.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Bodhi, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm joining you on my vacation from Florida at my sister's house today. I think the internet may work better here than it does at work, so hopefully we'll be able to get through this without too much interruption. I'm going to go ahead now and share my screen. And if you need me to have any questions, I'm sure you can ask those in the chat or the questions and answers. I'm happy to take them whenever. Okay, got the screen shared, and now I should be sharing my PowerPoint mode. Okay, great. All right, guys, let's get started today. I think I have about 40 minutes or so to get through most of this. And if I don't, then I'll give you a treat and I'll end early. Okay, so
Sara, you have 50 minutes?
50 minutes. All right, there you go.
That's stretch it just fine.
Oh, we're fine then. No worries. I can talk quickly. Yeah, so today I thought I would give you all an overview of just some general plant disease management tactics that I use in both fruit crop pathology and woody ornamental pathology, and that I preach to my stakeholders here in North Carolina. And then we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit and go into a new dieback issue that's been plaguing the maple and the redbud and the dogwood industries here in the Southeast. And it's a new development. We're working on determining the causal agents of this dieback issue, but we'll go into that so that you're more aware of it and that you can drive Gene Woodward Williams crazy about it if you're from Georgia. And then also talk about a few other dieback problems. Okay. And so, yeah, like I was mentioning, and this is a little bit more formal of an intro here, the goals for today. The first thing is when I get a call from a grower, it's not always a pathology or a disease issue, even though the horticulturists like Bodhi probably tell you that it is. I'm just joking, but I'm always going back and forth with the horticulturists when we see some plant decline issues. And oftentimes it's an issue of both abiotic and antibiotic problems. But I'm going to go ahead and give you some strategies for diagnosing plant diseases. And then we're going to go into identifying some of those factors that promote disease development. Why do diseases happen? It's actually a fairly rare event where many things have to come together just perfectly. And unfortunately, those events come together more here in the Southeast than they do in my home state of New York. Okay, so we'll go into that. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to shift gears and bring everyone up to speed on this new dieback issue that we've been observing in young redbud, dogwoods and maples. Go into some possible mitigation strategies for the new dieback issue. It's tough when you don't have a causal agent yet, but we'll talk about some things that you might be able to do to mitigate that. And then lastly, give you just a little bit of more of an idea of if it's not this new dieback issue that I'll be describing, what are some other dieback and wilt problems that you might more commonly encounter in redbud, maple, and some other crop or other ornamentals, and what are some management options for those? All right, let's get rocking and rolling now. All right. So the first thing is, if you were to call me, I'm an extension specialist, and I work closely with county agents and regional agents and disease clinics on helping to diagnose plant diseases. And the first deal here is every time I go out there, I get a phone call. I ask, what cultivar, what variety are we dealing with? And why might I ask? Because different cultivars and varieties have different levels of resistance or tolerance to certain pathogens, okay? And as Bodhi mentioned earlier, I also work on fruit crops. You're going to see a mix of fruit crops and also ornamentals here. But when I get a phone call, we have this terrible disease on blackberries, and it's called orange rust. It's a fungus, and the problem with this fungus of orange that causes orange rust is that it can invade vascularly through the blackberry plant. And of course, when something like that happens and the pathogen gets in there vascularly, it's really hard to control. And that pretty much means the end of the plant. Conversely, we also get another rust disease on blackberries, and that's called cane and leaf rust. It's more of a yellow color, and it's much less problematic. We can usually just deal with use fungicides to deal with that and some cultural control mechanisms. So why would I ask about cultivar Navajo? One type of blackberry is extremely susceptible to orange rust. So if someone told me they had orange pustules or yellow colored pustules on their blackberry and it was a Navajo, I would think, yeah, you've got the orange rust. However, if they told me they were growing a cultivar like Traveler, that's resistant or highly tolerant to orange rust. And so I would suspect a much less problematic cane and leaf rust. And that could certainly have results or have impacts in the sense that a grower would have to pull out their Navajos, but not the Travelers. Okay, let's move on. The second deal here is that you need to know what a healthy plant looks like to begin with. Okay, so these are two photographs of roses from our disease clinic here in North Carolina. And roses have thorns. That's why I hate working with them. Okay, but we have a terrible, we're the most terrible rose rosette disease that's also causing problems throughout the region and throughout the US. Here on the left, whereas you have a healthy rose here on the right. And, you can see just by comparing a more healthy rose to a diseased rose in this case, is that you get this overproduction of thorns when you have rose rosette disease. You'll have leaf color changes. Sometimes if we're not talking about this, maybe we're talking about Fraser firs or evergreens and needle drop. What does that mean? Do needles have a certain time of year that they drop? Or is it related to a canker on the plant and a disease? Okay. So just keep that in mind. If you ever went through an apple orchard in June, apple trees exhibit something called June drop, where the apples just fall down naturally during that time. It's a self-thinning mechanism for apple trees. But for those who aren't aware of June drop, they might think something else is wrong, either a nutrient problem, maybe a canker that's causing the apples to fall or whatnot. So you need to know the normal physiology and appearance of healthy plants. The next thing is that you need to consider the timing of disease development. Okay, so what do we mean by that? There are certain periods of when a host is susceptible or not susceptible to a disease. Also, there are times of the season where a pathogen may not be active or a vector to move that pathogen, like a virus vector, may not be present. Okay, so we need to think of those things. And any of you that work with pears in the landscape or crab apples, you're likely familiar with fire blight. Roses can get it too, but the poster children are really pears, plum fruits such as pear trees, apple trees, etc. And here I've got two different photos. I've got a photo of an apple tree in pink bud and a photograph of an apple tree in bloom there. And so let's say I took a bunch of bacteria that cause fire blight on apple trees, right? And I sprayed those pink buds. When the blooms emerged, they would look healthy. And why is that? Because you need to have the stigmatic surface of the flower there for the bacteria to populate and to prepare for infection. Nothing would happen if I sprayed this at pink bud because there would be nowhere for the bacteria to populate and infect. Okay. Conversely here, if I went ahead and I sprayed at bloom, the same thing, right? I'd have that stigmatic surface, and that's the key stage for fire blight infections to occur. Okay. So here I would have a nasty fire blight infection. And when I talk about a pathogen being present, but it needs to develop heat hours and it needs to be able to move around in order for disease to happen. So here is an oozing canker from fire blight. And if the cankers aren't oozing yet, it hasn't been warm enough for cankers to ooze. then a fire blight infection wouldn't occur likely either because you wouldn't have that inoculum around. Then you need to consider the distribution, the environment, and the management history. So once upon a time, when I first arrived in North Carolina, we're in the mountains, and there are very wet spots in the morning in those mountains. That fog sometimes doesn't move until noon, and there's dew on the grass and there's dew on the leaves, really causing a perfect environment for infection. So I got a call from a grower, and he called me out and he said, "Sara, look at my apples. Look at my leaves were all had phytotoxicity on them." He says, "I don't know what happened." And he says, "My trees up the hill down yonder, they look a lot better." And I said, "Oh, okay." And it looked like it was some level of chemical injury, the way this quickly occurred to all trees in this one area. And it turned out that it was the time of day that he sprayed. He sprayed something called Captan, a fungicide, on the leaves, and Captan shouldn't penetrate the cuticle. And so when he had those slow drying conditions, it allowed Captan to slowly penetrate that cuticle. The apples didn't have a waxy protection on them yet, and it caused all of that injury. Whereas when he applied later in the day, it was fine. And that's why you might see greater injury sometimes on younger leaves if you have a chemical injury, a fungicide problem or insecticide, phytotoxicity problem, rather than the old leaves there. Right. Again, when I first started, I got this Nandina that came in from an extension agent, and they weren't sure if there was a virus or if there was herbicide. And I was brand new and I didn't have any virus testing kits. I really didn't know much about the disease clinic on the main campus in Raleigh. And so I just let it sit and took care of this plant on my desk for a few weeks. And I figured if it was a herbicide, hopefully the plant would grow out of it and we would see new tissue, whereas with the virus, the plant would continue to decline. And eventually the plant ended up growing out of this. And so I figured this was most likely an abiotic issue like chemical injury that caused the Nandina to look like this. And of course, one of my most favorite examples, and this was when I was in New York at Cornell, was the crisis of the blue leaf spots. And no, these really weren't blue leaf spots. They were more of a phytotoxicity problem. But I put blue on here just to illustrate the status. And so my boss, my mentor, and I were called out to an apple orchard. And this guy had this issue with phytotoxicity, these spots all over his leaves. And we thought, maybe it's pathogen. We're not quite sure. We took it back to the lab. We tried to culture off of it. And all we thought were these weird opportunistic fungi that really weren't pathogens in apple. So we went back out, and sure enough, there was the problem on the trees. His cherry trees also had the blue spots on them. And then we went over and his lettuce and his cabbage also had these symptoms on it. And we figured if this were a pathogen, it would be a big stretch to see it jumping from host to host and really all appearing at the same time. And oddly enough, there was an organic grower down the road from him, and the organic grower also had the same problems. And you think, all right, this is strange. We have two different growers, probably spraying at two different times, and one's organic and one's not. So they're probably not spraying the same thing. And then we looked, and there was a smokestack. And we said, okay, there's a smokestack. Great. Apparently, they had cleaned that smokestack about a week earlier with some pretty toxic bleach and other chemicals. And it was a misty day, and these orchards were located, these farms were located downwind from the smokestack, and it deposited all these chemicals on the fruit and on the foliage of these crops. And everything upwind was fine. So just consider your surroundings when you're trying to diagnose a plant disease. And then lastly, abiotic versus viral issues. I get this all the time, and sometimes I scratch my head, right? You get out there, a leaf looks red, it looks chlorotic. Sometimes you see this reddening or yellowing of vein regions on the leaf, and you're like, is this something I did? Is this something the environment did? Or could something biotic like a virus be causing this problem? So let's go ahead and take a look at this illustration here. Okay, the green circles represent healthy trees, and the red circles would represent symptomatic trees. Okay, in an abiotic problem, usually we'll see clustering. Perhaps there's not good drainage in an area. Perhaps something was sprayed. Perhaps there's a nutrient problem. But usually what we see is more clustering in a region, and the symptoms tend to come on pretty strong. They don't really advance too much. Okay? Whereas with the virus, you can see here that the symptoms, when I think about a virus, it's very unlikely that all of these symptoms would pop out at once. Okay. And most likely the symptoms would progress. So that's why you see these light pink circles here. They're not so severe at first. Okay. And again, it's quite sporadic. Okay? Now, over time, most likely these trees from this dark red, which means severe symptoms, would start to grow out of that. And you'd see this more gentle symptoms over a few weeks, right? And you wouldn't see any more trees at that point declining. Whereas with was a virus, you can see here that my light pink circles that had moderate symptoms now have severe symptoms. We have more moderate symptoms popping up and more symptomatic trees in general. Okay, so the disease is going to progress in that case. Now, I challenged you before and I said, it's really just not that common for a disease to occur. A lot needs to happen at once, right? A lot of factors have to come together. And you've probably heard about this disease triangle, but I just wanted to reiterate this again. Okay. Why do we have so many diseases to have to manage here in the Southeast continually? First of all, we have a really warm and humid climate. Think about your feet with socks on for a long day, running through an airport, walking in the field. Okay. Your feet stink, you get athlete's foot, whatever. Same thing here. Pathogens just love infection. Okay. And plus, these humid and wet conditions create environments for disease to, number one, for infection to occur by the pathogen and then disease to develop rather quickly. Okay. And then also what we've been experiencing on anything that blooms, we often get inadequate chilling hours. And this so often will create this longer period of susceptibility, especially to things that have like blossom infections. We'll get rat tail or prolonged blooms, like we spoke about in fire blight. Okay. So what do we need? First of all, we need a susceptible host. Okay. And so what do we mean by a susceptible host? Think about your dog with heartworms, right? Probably I'm not going to get heartworm for my dog, but dogs can get heartworm, right? So they're a susceptible host. I'm not a susceptible host for heartworm. Okay. So you need a susceptible host. And like we mentioned with the blossom blight before, that susceptible host has to be in a growth stage where infection can occur. So in this case, the fire blight, you have blossoms that are open. And for many diseases, you really need, young succulent tissue. So with a disease like powdery mildew, let's think about, you won't see powdery mildew developing on older, more rough, mature leaves. And why is that? Because powdery mildew doesn't infect old tissue. It likes that young succulent tissue. It makes things a lot easier for the pathogen to cause a lot of damage. As we mentioned before, not only do you need that susceptible host, but you also need maybe some sort of vector, or you might need that pathogen to actually be present. A lot of these pathogens don't like the cold weather, just like I don't like the cold weather, and they want to hibernate in their house. Okay, same deal here. Okay, that pathogen needs to be present. It needs to be ready to release spores. And also, if it requires a vector to either move around, like fire blight might, or a virus, that needs to be active as well at that time too. Okay. And then lastly, you need a conducive environment. I spoke about the heat and the moisture to increase the probability of infection once the pathogen lands on the host. But you also need it just for spores to move around. Think about it. An insect, they have life easy. They have feet, they have legs, they have wings. They can move around rather easily and target their host. With pathogens, they're stuck, right? They need something like wind or rain to splash it around, okay? Keep that in mind. And that's the disease triangle. Other challenges in the Southeast, I mentioned how warm and humid we are. Right? I got to NC State in late 2015. And I work in Surrey County, which is northern North Carolina. I go up there often to work on grape diseases there and some apple problems as well, and some boxwood problems as well. But anyway, you can see here, this is rainfall in the south in Surrey County. Historical average is 47 inches. And you can see here that for the most part, we were above that historical average for the past 10 to 11 years or so. And that's really problematic. And why? Pathogen dispersal, we just spoke about. Okay, if you have a lot of water residue or water droplets on a leaf, that's going to lead to decreased germination of spores and decreased infection time for those spores to actually infect the leaf tissue. Greater number of secondary cycles is a problem, right? That means that we're getting more and more generations of spores of a fungus per year. It'll increase that. Also think about fungicide residues and fungicide depletion, especially with protectant fungicides like Captan, Mancozeb, chlorothalonil. That can wash it off. If you're not getting as large a dose of a fungicide on a plant, that can increase your risk of fungicide resistance. So keep that in mind. And then lastly, higher inoculant pressure for next season in general, because you have more infection events when it rains and when it's very moist out. Checking on time in here. Cool. All right. So now let's go ahead and just talk about a few disease management options. And the first one is deterrence. And this is usually a pre-plant tactic, I would say. And I'm doing this right now in my house and my landscape. You want to minimize abiotic and biotic factors favoring disease. In Rockingham County, North Carolina, I visited a lot of homeowners that want to put apple trees in their backyard, just a single apple tree or two. And they keep having fire blight issues in their backyard. And why is that? They have a bunch of Bradford pears in their neighborhood that bloom earlier than fire blight, and they just line the streets. Okay. And like I said, they're full of fire blight. And that fire blight gets from the Bradford pears over to the apple trees in home of the homeowner. Okay. So think about that. You don't want to plant something that's susceptible when you have a bunch of plants that are infected already with a common problem. Okay. So you want to try to deter that. You think about host resistance. Okay. That's a big one. And even Meadows, my colleague at NC State's, been doing a lot of work of understanding what bedding plants you could use that are more tolerant or more resistant to Phytophthora. And the same concept here, okay? Another pre-plant tactic is just simply choose plants that are hosts that are less susceptible to your most economically devastating diseases in your region. So this is a red delicious, and here's a golden delicious. And I infected this with the fungus called Colototricum. It causes bitter rot on apples. And you can see here that the red delicious was much less susceptible compared to the golden delicious. So you might want to consider something like that. All right. Next, if you can plant, if these are grafted plants, think about if that grafting region can impart any resistance. I tell homeowners with apple trees all the time to try to plant something with a resistant rootstock. Because even if it hits the scion, the main cultivar part of the tree, when the infection happens, oftentimes we can save it with a resistant rootstock. A big tactic that I tell homeowners all the time, because they don't have the abundance of trees that maybe a nurseryman has or an orchard has, is to make sure to remove that overwintering inoculum and deter those opportunistic pathogens. A lot of times homeowners don't have the same level or the same severity of disease as commercial growers just because they don't have all that inoculum hanging around. So oftentimes when you have leaves fall, and this happens in apples, but any really plant or fruit, a lot of times they'll just sit on the ground for the winter. That's problematic because what happens is these fungal structures will start to form. And what will happen then is that there are spores inside of these that mature and then get released. So if you get rid of all this overwintering inoculum crud, hopefully you can have less disease pressure the following year. Okay. And here's a big one. Shamat's on a proposal with me on SCRI grid right now. It's me looking at ambrosia beetles. Okay, they're a big issue in dogwoods, big issue in apples lately as well, and several other ornamental trees. So with ambrosia beetles, they're attracted to stressed trees, especially when things are flooded. Okay, so make sure that you're practicing proper horticultural practices to lessen the stress. And then here, let's quickly move on to a few other options. Biologicals. I often get questions about biological products. And what really are biological products? They come in a few different types of modes of action, I would say. A lot of them, such as your bacillus compounds that you may be familiar with, actually secrete their own antimicrobials or their own antibiotics, and that's how they deter pathogens. So it's not a competition deal with those. But there are some biologicals that compete with the pathogen. So basically, they're competing for space on the tissue surface or a stigmatic surface. Okay. And then lastly, there's phages, bacteriophage, they're called. And these are viruses of bacteria that can go in and destroy bacterial cells. In general, what are some of the problems of biologicals? First, I've done a lot of trials with them, and they just don't tend to be as efficacious as conventional products. You may be in a low disease pressure setting, but we need to worry about high disease pressure settings if something like the box of blight comes around, right? We test under high pressure conditions. the performance isn't as consistent. So I'm making great results one year and just really cruddy results the next year with them. Or my colleague Carrick in New York might get great results one year, and the same year I might get terrible results. But it's just not that consistent oftentimes. But what's great about them is that they have a short reentry interval, mostly used in organic production. And then some of them are pretty cool. They induce plant defenses. It's like taking the vitamin C, I would argue, if someone in your household has a cold. It just brings your immune system up. And we do have inducers for plants that can do the same deal. Another management option are certainly the protectant fungicides. And these are your coppers, your manzakes, your captans, chlorothalonil, like and whatnot. And these are really efficacious, right? They've been around for 50, 70 years. My issues with them is that they tend to harm non-targets a bit more. They're not that specific. Then they are only protected. So that means they have no curative or kickback activity if an infection event happens. But they're great because they have a low risk for resistance development. Secondly, we can also use the locally systemic fungicides, and these are your more recent fungicides, perhaps something like Eagle, Orchestra. What are some others? Pathogens, and so Compass, and so forth with those. And we often refer to these as locally systemic or single-site fungicides. They're often efficacious on a number of phytopathogenic fungi. They often target very specific enzymes of a fungus. So they don't often harm non-targets, although they can. They're a bit more safe, I would argue. What's cool about them is that they can get inside the plant tissue. So they don't really move up and down the vascular tissue all that much, but they locally move within a fruit or within a leaf. And a lot of these have translaminar activity, meaning if you spray it on the top of the surface like that, the fungicide can move down through the blade of the leaf and end up on the bottom. So your coverage isn't as necessary. And unlike something like a protectant fungicide, redistribution of that fungicide is not through like rain or something like that. It's just not as important or as necessary. Okay. Now let's go ahead now for the second half of this presentation and just bring everyone up to speed on this new dieback issue. I'm not sure if you've heard of it yet or whatnot, but what I'm talking about, what you might have heard of it called is Ceratobasidium or vascular dieback or just simply CT. Okay, but we'll get into that. And then again, the possible mitigation strategies that you can do now, and then quickly some other problems that you might encounter. So we started getting calls back in North Carolina, maybe 2018, 2019, probably 2019 more, a couple of years ago. And it was sporadic, these phone calls into the clinic. But we were seeing this strange dieback on young maples, young dogwoods, and young redbuds. And here are some of the symptoms here. Okay, you can see that most of the foliation is beginning at the top right here. Okay, you can see some of the leaves here on this dogwood just becoming purple or red. And up here, you can even see some wilting occurring. So these samples were brought into our disease clinic by a regional specialized extension agent. And our very skilled and veteran plant pathologists within the clinic couldn't identify any pathogens that were associated with this. It wasn't Verticillium. He found no Botryosphaeria or Phomopsis or other common opportunistic pathogens that might be causing problems and so forth. So this was really a head scratcher and unfortunate because we couldn't tell anyone, the grower, the clients, what the problem was. Now, here on redbud, the symptoms look fairly similar. You can see here in a newly planted nursery that the issue is sporadic, meaning some of the redbuds were looking great. For other ones, we were seeing this deep reddening, failure to thrive, stunting, and so forth, premature defoliation. And oftentimes you'd see this dieback issue where you'd see blackening of the woody tissue there, absence of leaves, and so forth. Here's another example on the redbud here. You can see here this wilting also is a symptom. So it leads us to believe that vascular tissue was involved, followed by leaf fluorosis, simply meaning that the leaves were suddenly turning yellow, this light green, then yellow, and then often falling off. Okay, and you can see this whole plant affected here, but perhaps not much down the row as you see in this situation here. But the calls to the clinic started becoming more and more common. So here you go, again, reddening on the leaf margins. The whole leaf becomes red. And again, it turns this very crunchy, dry leaves in this case. Okay. And so we were getting calls from all across North Carolina, not just in one area of the state. A few inquiries came in from Tennessee as well and started to take this a bit more seriously. And we cut open and these samples were sent to the clinic. Oftentimes we would see this vascular streaking and necrosis right through the vascular bundles, as you see in that case. And here again, you can see the vascular bundles involved, the xylem involved here and here as well if you cut in. So we did test for viruses. Oftentimes with viruses, you might see some of these spectacular fluorosis issues and this reddening issue, but what you won't see often is involvement of the woody tissue in this necrosis in this case. Okay. So Mike Muster said, all right, let me keep trying here. And he teamed up with Purdue University's clinic to get a better idea, maybe something molecular that they could do to help identify this fungus or this issue, I should say. So what he did is he stuck the tissue in what we call a moist chamber, and he started to see fungal tufts growing from it. And you can see here, this fungus just started pouring out of the vascular tissue in here as well. Okay. And again, none of this was anything opportunistic. So it was just seemed to be this one fungus. And when he looked at it underneath the microscope, he was finally able to identify this, or at least isolate it, as something that very much resembled Ceratobasidium Theobromiae, which is also known as CT, a fungal pathogen that actually attacks cacao. Okay. So through morphology diagnostics, underneath the microscope and in culture, and said, oh, this really looks like Ceratobasidium Theobromiae. Oftentimes, though, when we look at things molecularly, it's not often the best way to identify a pathogen. And why is that? Well, colonies or the morphology, the way it looks in culture can change based on temperature conditions, based on light conditions, based on humidity conditions, and so forth. So what we often want to do is do molecular tests. What we're doing for COVID right now. We've all talked about PCR tests, and that's really what we wanted to do here. Okay. So what we can use here is something called PCR. Okay. And we use what we call our general primers or general molecular tools to identify the genus of what the fungus is. Okay. Now, the big problem here was getting a clean culture of this fungus because he could not get it separated from the plant. It had to grow with the plant in culture. Okay, so what we did is he went ahead and they isolated the fungus the best they could, and they ended up getting a fairly clean hit for, again, Ceratobasidium Theobromiae. But what they want to do next is get even more specific primers to distinguish species. So they're like, all right, this is in the Ceratobasidium genus, but we need more specific primers or more specific sequence data to figure out the species. So what does all this mean? So far, we think that the morphology and DNA sequencing that indicates a strong similarities to Ceratobasidium Theobromiae. Okay. But again, we're just not 100% sure. So what we're saying right now is that with this dieback issue on redbud, on dogwood, on maple, that Ceratobasidium Theobromiae is associated with dieback on redbud, but we don't know if it's causing the dieback on redbud, maple, or dogwood. Okay. And why is that? Again, in order to figure out causal problems, we need to get this pathogen into our culture and isolate it purely. They're having problems doing that because the fungus is very difficult to grow outside of its host. Okay, so it seems to be highly dependent to grow along with the host. Okay. So as I mentioned, the CT fungus does cause vascular streak dieback on cacao, and that's very similar in many ways to what we are seeing here on the redbud, maple, and dogwood here in the Southeast. You can see here that you get this chlorosis, premature defoliation. You get reddening of leaf margins, followed by complete reddening of the whole leaves. The fungal tufts often grow out on leaf scars after leaves have prematurely fallen off. And then you have also vascular bundle involvement and symptoms in the vascular tissue. Okay, so it does appear to be somewhat similar. So what have we done about this? In December of 21, we hosted a Redbud Dieback Summit, and that was attended by extension specialists, extension agents, industry members, and throughout the Southeast, including North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina. Purdue did a lot of the diagnostic works. And like I said, many independent diagnostic companies. What did we talk about? Symptoms, host affected, current research, if anything has been done, which hasn't really. And then some management strategies and the possibility of forming a working group. And what we concluded was that this is present pretty much everywhere throughout the Southeast. A lot of people just assume this to be a typical, maybe Verticillium issue or maybe a Botryosphaeria issue. Okay. The problem here is that you growers that are out there and you nurserymen are having several trees dying due to some issue that we still haven't completely identified the causal problem. Okay. But it's very difficult from a university standpoint to give you direct management strategies if we haven't diagnosed the problem 100%. All we can say at this point is that this Ceratobasidium like fungus that has been identified at the disease clinics is regularly associated with the symptoms, the dieback symptoms that we are seeing in the three hosts that I've previously mentioned. Okay. And so why is this management difficult? Because management strategies are largely dependent on pathogen life cycles. So it would be very irresponsible for me to go out there and say, oh, spray this, even because I don't know the right timing. We don't know what's causing the problem. And we want to, the product isn't specifically labeled for Ceratobasidium, right? So we need to be careful in how we approach this. But at the same time, I'm out there in the field with you guys all the time. And it's like your trees are dying and you need to do something about this. Okay. So what we're saying right now, what we're telling nurserymen, growers, is that the first line of defense is really inspect all of those liners of at-risk hosts for signs of cankers, decline, and then monitor those throughout the season. Okay, if this is Ceratobasidium, it can likely spread, so you might want to put trees in maybe a new area if it's one of these hosts, okay? So be careful of that. My suspicions is that it may be coming in on liners. It's strange that we'd have this new issue pop up about the same time all throughout different regions. Okay, so that leads me to believe it's not coming in from the natural environment and that it was introduced somehow into the Southeast. Certainly, we can go back to the discussion I had earlier about cultural control, but you want to make sure that you maintain good cultural practices. Make sure you're removing and destroying all those leaves that fall prematurely. Again, there are thousands of spores on each of those lesions. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay? Because if it is Ceratobasidium, what we know in cacao is that it's a vascular pathogen. Okay, which often means that the symptoms that are showing up are much slower than pathogen is moving through the xylem tissue. So what you'll want to do is cut those symptomatic branches at least 12 inches back from necrotic symptoms. So any kind of canker or blackening, because this is a vascular problem, make sure you're cutting back further than the way. And then again, avoid the overhead irrigation if you can. That's a big, but no, it's going to move spores around and also lead to more favorable infection conditions. And then maintain good airflow. Okay? Get it in a field, those trees where you get a lot of wind, a lot of breeze. If you do suspect something like Ceratobasidium or this dieback, this Ceratobasidium associated dieback, I'll call it. If these trees are in containers, try to move those away from healthy plants. And, if they're in the field, I would consider destroying that whole tree at that point. Okay, when it's a vascular issue, the best form of prevention is just that, right? With preventative fungicides. If it's already in the vascular tissue, that fungicide's going to have a heck of a time trying to go after that pathogen. Okay. You have a wonderful cooperative extension service. These folks are on alert. The disease clinics are on alert for this problem. So I would call them up and submit samples. If you can, bring in the whole piece of wood with leaves as well. It's always helpful. Yeah. What about fungicides? I make my living off of fungicides, I feel like. I work with fungicide resistance. I do a lot of efficacy trials. All right. What is my concern? You're going to hear a lot of folks, right, from industry trying to help you out on what to apply. Like, what is the problem with me telling you what fungicides to apply? Well, first, we don't know that Ceratobasidium or even the pathogen is causing this dieback. Again, it's been associated in every case that I know, but I can't go as far to say that Ceratobasidium is causing this new dieback issue. And so we don't necessarily know the pathogen or know the causal agent, then we can't really, in our good faith, tell you to spray for it. Okay, and then secondly, if we don't have a causal pathogen, nothing's labeled for it. So if you decide to spray something, just don't go complaining to the companies. Technically, and I think legally, you can spray a fungicide if the host is labeled for it. But again, there's no guarantee that that will work. However, I will leave you with this recommendation here, in that if we look at Ceratobasidium and cacao, what they spray is a propiconazole product and a strobilurin rotation of maybe something like frac 11 like Heritage. And those have been efficacious immediately following premature leaf excision. Okay, so those work on the problem in cacao. But again, we just don't know if that's the same issue that we're seeing here in the Southeast. So what are we going to be doing for you? Number one, at least in North Carolina, we're going to conduct a survey. Okay, we need like a circumstantial evidence case. We want to get a better idea as to what cultivars or varieties are most being impacted, what kind of production practices might favor disease development or dieback development, I should say, where maybe the stock, the liners came in from. So we want to get a better idea of that. Here in North Carolina, we're working with the disease clinic to diagnose suspect samples. And we're hoping that we can start to funnel some of these samples from even from other states so we can have a consistent diagnosis of the problems. And then just make sure you're scouting and looking out for the new problem or any diseases, I should say, in young planters. What about other dieback issues? I'm just going to finish real quickly here. With Botryosphaeria, that's another big one. That tends to be more opportunistic in nature, I would argue. Usually what you'll see is a flagging. So you won't see necessarily all that dieback. You'll see more specific dieback of a branch or something along those lines, and you'll see that flagging there. Okay, if you look closely, the wood just tends to be more cankered. And if you cut cross-section wise into that wood, oftentimes you'll see like this V shape going toward the center. Also with Botryosphaeria, every case that I've ever seen it, we see this purplish color with the necrosis area right near where you cut. Okay, Botryosphaeria loves to get into pruning wounds. And oftentimes I also see a lot of flaking and blistering of bark, on the outside there. So keep that in mind. And what are some predisposing factors? Unlike most pathogens, Botryosphaeria actually loves more dry weather. So drought can cause Botryosphaeria infections to become symptomatic. Freeze injury, we get a lot of that up where I am in North Carolina, and herbicide injury as well. Right, so keep that in mind. And then lastly, you want to keep in mind Verticillium wilt here. With Verticillium wilt, oftentimes it'll look very similar when you cut through a cross section there, and oftentimes you'll also see reddening on young plants. Got too many animations there. But usually we don't necessarily see Verticillium as much in this hot weather. It's more of a cool weather pathogen in general, the species that will be causing you problems. Okay, oftentimes we can find that pretty quickly in the disease clinic as well. All right, and with that, I'm going to skip that. And with 5 minutes left, I just want to know if you have any questions. And thank you for listening to me blab on for the last 50 minutes or so.
Hey, Sarah, I would say you still have some time. So if you can go back to the Verticillium and just go over because
I
you
just
still have
wanted to make
time.
sure we were cool there. All right.
We are cool.
All right, cool. So yeah, with Verticillium, like I said, you're going to see more flagging. You don't see as much dieback there, and you'll see reddening or scorching. Usually, the acute phase of it, you'll see more flagging, whereas chronic, the plant has started to decline over a period of time. Where we've seen the dieback CT-associated issues that I was speaking about, those tend to be fairly rapid within weeks. Yeah, and usually, like I said, it's a cooler weather pathogen that can affect, and symptoms will show up after really hot and dry weather. So it'll affect, it might hang in there latently, not causing any issues. And then all of a sudden you get a hot, dry spell. And then we see that. And we haven't seen necessarily yet any sort of consistency of when symptoms of the CT associated dieback might be popping up. Okay. I hate all these. So I gave my research assistant, I made the last of this slide here. So I wasn't used to it. But yeah, anyway, with these, Verticillium's going to have a fairly wide host range. The big deal here is that with Verticillium, it's a pain in the butt also to get rid of. And that's because of the microsclerotia. So if you do have Verticillium and you've had it on a maple tree or another host in your landscape, the deal there is you can't just go back in and replant. And we say this with boxwoods as well. Why? Because both boxwood blight and Verticillium wilt have microsclerotia as their resting or overwintering structures. And those dudes are a real bear to destroy. They can hang out in the soil for 6 to 7 years. They're very resistant to environmental breakdown or environmental conditions. And really, they just hang out there. And we try to tell you to avoid going back into areas that have had Verticillium in the past, into soils where it's been a problem. And really, if you absolutely have to, we'd say plant a more tolerant cultivar or tolerant host. And if you can't do that, make sure you're going ahead and burying and mulching to try to prevent spores from popping up from those microsporotia. Yeah. And, how to manage that. Really, no fungicides are all that effective, especially once the tree or the plant's already infected. Again, delaying symptoms is the big deal. Make sure you're irrigating if you've got irrigation in place, or make sure you tell a homeowner to get that irrigation, that hose out, even though it may be expensive. Avoid excess fertilizer in those cases. It'll just help the pathogen move through quicker. And then again, it's that cultural control, pruning off those dead limbs, at least a few inches back, hopefully a foot back, and then get them away. Don't just leave them there and hope that your dog picks them up. Make sure they get away and that you burn them. Okay, so that way there's no inoculant flying around in those areas. All right, and that's the deal with Verticillium. I'm happy to take any questions here before we go pick the nieces up from daycare.
Thank you, Sarah. This was wonderful. We have 4 questions in the questions. So if you pop this up, I can read them to you if you prefer, or you can read them yourself.
I'll read them if that sounds cool. Yeah. Okay. So let's see here. I'll just go in order. So from Craig, I have a few pecan trees, pecan, whichever, pecan trees. And I had to take some trees out because they had some sort of knot at the base of the trunk close to the ground. So I'm not a pecan grower, but I don't know if that was an insect-related issue or if it was a pathology-related issue. But yeah, if it does have some fungal issue and it is close to the ground, yeah, a lot of the times we really can't do much about it. It's the worst thing when you've got something close to the base there, because that means, especially if it's vascular, that means there's not much else you can prune to get that pathogen out of. All right, we've got Ronald. The part about Bradford pears and apple blight. I've got apples and pears. It says peaches and Chicago pears within 60 feet of each other. My peaches drop all green. I occasionally maybe get 5 apples and maybe 5 pears. I don't spray anything. My garden is in the middle. I don't spray my garden, but that's great. Any comments you might have would be appreciated. So yeah, why do we get so few apples is really a good question. There could be a few issues. I'm not a horticulturist, but to me, the question I would have is, do you have another pollinator? So oftentimes you need a different cultivar or even a crab tree in the area to help cross-pollinate. Okay, so my next door neighbor had a Galen apple tree. It doesn't self-pollinate. I told them to put in a crab apple because they weren't getting any apples. And then don't you know, a year later, they were full of apples. So that can certainly be one issue. Alternate bearing can be another problem, which we see often in Honeycrisp, where you might get a big load one year, a cruddy load the next year. But yeah, or you could have had a freeze during bloom, which destroyed it. So there could be a lot of issues associated with that. Okay, Phil, timing of propiconazole strobilurin application for maple dieback. So what I would say is that anytime you have excessive leaf drop in the middle of a season, whether it's CT associated or not, or you're pruning, that leaves a nice area for something, a pathogen to get in. And let's pretend that we're not spraying for CT. I'm not telling you to because we're not 100% sure. But my argument would be that you have a leaf abscission that's not going to necessarily heal that quickly, or you're pruning. I would go ahead and often put on a fungicide application anyway to protect those wounds. That would be the timing that I would say. Simply because if this is CT, we just don't know the life cycle of it now. So I would just do more general protection. And if you have any sort of wound, go ahead and cover that up. Cool. All right. And then lastly, let's see, Robert, can you cut back infected tissue with pruners and dip in alcohol after every cut? And have you seen new growth that is healthy? Also, low ground more susceptible than high ground. I'm guessing you're talking about perhaps the CT associated issue. So yeah, with cutting, yeah, I would go ahead and cut and then dip in alcohol. I usually say anywhere 70% solution is good. Don't use bleach. It degrades quickly under UV light, and it's going to completely ruin your pruning shears there. Have we seen new growth that is healthy? So with that question, I haven't heard of any agents or anything that these trees, they're really the ones on the front lines, and I haven't heard of them bouncing back after this case. Like firefly, once it's in there, we don't really see much healthy tissue emerging. And also, low ground more susceptible than high ground. Are you talking about the elevation? That I don't know, and I haven't heard any reports. I would assume that with maybe the warm. Now, I just don't know enough about that to comment on. I'm going to go the safe way on that. I think that's
All right.
cool.
I have a question.
I'll do my best.
Sure. So you mentioned there were 3 hosts of the CT, the redbud, the cacao, and what was the third one?
So cacao's the big one in Costa Rica, and that's why we've looked to that as, all right, maybe we can at least start to get an idea of this. If it is a pathogen, what's going on here? But dogwood, maple, and redbud seem to be the 3 main young ones, right? That seem to be under 5 years old, seem to be the big problems. We've been seeing them in homeowner areas. We've been seeing them in nurseries under this decline.
Interesting, because these 3 are from different families. That seems to indicate that it has a pretty broad host range. And I was also wondering what other native plants you may have seen or any this fungus on.
So we haven't done any work on that yet. I was just alerted to this fall, really, because the disease clinic does so much here with the agents. Not that I'm aware of about natural host or weeds, but it's something definitely that we need to start looking into, I would argue, for sure. Once we can get some money. So that's the goal here, is that we start some surveys this year, get an idea, and then write some proposals as we move forward here. There's been a lot of pathologists out there that are a little bit more concerned and just want to push it away a little bit. And I don't want to say push it away, actually, but just don't want to make it that much of an alert. But I don't know if I'm a nursery woman or man and I'm a grower or even a homeowner, I'd be concerned. And so we're just trying to help you. It's right in front of your eyes, the dieback. It's nothing we can really hide at this point, is my argument.
There's a question from Phil again.
Yeah. Is it in the question? Hold on here. Let's see. Where is it here? Okay. I know you can't recommend probe or stroke for the maple dieback. Cool. But will it be fixed up better in the spring, summer, fall, or winter? Better to trim in the summer or winter? Yeah. So what I would say, number one about the trimming, if you see an infection in the summertime, make sure you go ahead and prune that out on a day that's not so wet and that might be cooler if possible. But particularly don't go out when it's wet outside. But general pruning, that's out of my area, unfortunately, just because I'm more apples. So what we do in most of the fruit crops that I work on, we prune in the winter time. It's just the pathogens are more at bed at that time. That said, also, what if it gets taken up better? That I don't have a great answer to. What I would say is timing wise, I would be spraying it again just to protect any sort of pruning wound anyway. So, that's how I would answer that question. I don't know how much better it would be taken up at certain times of the year. I would assume summer would be better than winter. Cool.
Great.
Cool, guys.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And thank you for inviting me again. It was fun, especially when I don't have to leave. the house, it's even more
And,
fun.
and when you have your survey, you just let us know and we'll try to get you
Great.
participation from Georgia as well.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you so much. Look forward to it.
Sure.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.